Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to today's discussion forum for Best of DAG 2018, Emotions and Decision Analysis, sponsored by the Society of Decision Professionals. First, I'd like to introduce you to one of our discussants, Iyas Radad. Iyas is a senior research advisor at Lilly Research Laboratories, Decision Science and Portfolio Strategy Department. Since he joined Eli Lilly in 2001, he applied sophisticated data analytics and strategic frameworks to improve decision-making in drug discovery and development process and led a group of scientists in his technical area of pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. He later moved to Chorus, the industry-renowned innovative early development engine, where he established the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics function. In 2017, Iyas established and led research decision analytics function in Lilly Research Laboratories, with a mission that includes portfolio management, decision consulting, and decision education. Iyas holds a BS in pharmacy and a PhD in pharmaceutics. Iyas completed an MBA from MIT Sloan School of Management in 2013. Iyas will facilitate your questions throughout today's discussion with Elaine, and I will now turn further introductions over to him. Iyas, thank you for being with us today. You have the floor.
Thank you, Brig. I would like to start with introducing my other colleagues who will be discussants today. I'll start with Soumik Raha. Soumik is a decision analysis PhD alum from the Department of Management Science and Engineering at Stanford University. His PhD dissertation titled Achieving Clarity on Value focused on aligning decisions with core values, and he has continued to build on that research and share it publicly. He was head of product at Smart.org for 6 years, where he led a team to build the world's first Excel-based portfolio decision analysis platform on the cloud. At Ulu Ventures, where he is today, Soumik works at the intersection of values, decision analysis, and technology. Elaine Ko, Director of Portfolio and Decision Analysis Group in Pfizer, currently holds a director position at that department in Pfizer. She has over 15 years of experience in applying decision analysis to investment decision-making under uncertainties. Her focus is primarily within the pharmaceutical industry, in particular, drug research and development R&D decisions, long-term planning, and disease area portfolio prioritization. She works with both the R&D teams and senior management, making funding decisions. Elaine has worked in the consulting and corporate settings across several industries, including healthcare, information technology, oil and gas, and mining. And now I will be sharing a few slides to begin this talk. I want to confirm, does everyone see my slide? That says Summary, Emotions, and DA.
Yes, looks good.
Thank you. All right, so this is a topic that continues our conversation that started in the Decision Analysis Affinity Group in 2018, earlier in the year. And there was a webinar that happened in June 20th in which there was an initial kind of re-presentation of the same topic. So I will summarize that presentation that happened on June 20th, and then we'll go on for reflections and questions that came from our audience over that time. So in that presentation, Soumik actually started with something that all decision analysts are quite familiar with, which is 4 decades of behavioral economics that showed that we make mistakes in decision making because of biases that are driven and anchored by our emotions to a large degree. Tversky and Kahneman, who is a Nobel laureate for a lot of this research, had really shown that emotions could bias our estimation and thus affect our decision making. So the first orientation towards emotion that decision analysts have is that of suspicion, and it is something that we need to manage in the decision analysis process.
Yes, may I interrupt you for just 1 second? It seems that we're seeing not the full screen slide mode.
Okay. Let me check here. Is it better now?
Yes, this is fine.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay. And then Somik actually used an example of a person, his name Gage, who had an accident that destroyed a portion of his brain. That portion, as his doctor suggested, was one that for several reasons was the best fitted for any part of the cerebral substance to sustain the injury. And the thought was that it did not really affect his cortical functions that are needed for typical function of a person, including decision making. That portion was actually the portion of the cortex that connects the cerebral thinking and executive function to the emotions. So he lost that connection. Unfortunately, that was far from the truth, as Antonio Damasio presented in his book, Descartes' Error. And that person had very difficult time making decisions, in addition to other personality changes that made his behavior affected negatively. And in later, in modern age, I guess, there was another case where a person, his name is Elliot, had also an error or an injury to his VMPFC, the same location in the brain. And upon a lot of tests, that person had very normal function in many, many tests, including frontal lobe dysfunction, alternative generation ability, new language ability, arithmetic ability, etc. So it appeared that he had everything that that person needed to make good decisions, because they could analyze decisions in a very rational way. However, that person was unable to decide properly, especially in the personal and social matters, and had no more strong emotions and can reason through problems, just not make a decision. And this is a quote from that person, that patient, where he said at the end of one session, after he had produced an abundant quantity of options for action, all of which were valid and implementable, Elliot smiled, apparently satisfied with his rich imagination, but added, "And after all this, I still would not know what to do." So he had the issue of knowing, but not really feeling. And because of that, was not able to make decisions. So from this, neurobiology tells us about emotions and reason, that seemingly normal reason can be disturbed by subtle biases rooted in emotions, and that's the Kahneman and Tversky's work, among others, on biases. But at the same time, reduction in emotion may constitute an equally important source of irrational behavior. So we do need both to be able to make good decisions. So the new view now is that the apparatus of rationality, traditionally presumed to be neurocortical, does not seem to work without the biological regulation of emotions, traditionally presumed to be subcortical. Nature appears to have built the apparatus of rationality not just on top of the apparatus of biological regulation, but also from it and with it. And this comes from Descartes' Error book by Antonio Damasio. So the implicit bottom line that Somik presented is that good decision is one where we feel balanced and achieve equanimity. And the real value of decision analysis is that it helps you cross the stormy seas and get to that equanimity, bringing in rationality in interplay with emotions. And that notion that we should not trust our emotions when making decisions, as they will misguide us, would not be one that we should fully basically assume, I would say, because emotions is also important in making decisions. And with that, feeling can also guide us. So it can misguide us, but can also guide us. So what if the purpose of decision analysis is to take complexity off the table so we can focus on who we want to be? And it only becomes possible to decide when we can feel, and we can't feel our way through when facing complex decisions. So this is a slight reorientation of our decision analysis practice in general terms. Somik presented also two kinds of metrics. The luminous metrics on the side are the ones that we typically use in decision analysis that shine a bright light that is practical on the situation. Examples are amounts of money raised or returns on investment metrics. While there are numinous metrics that drive our spirits and is driven by it, things that are beyond the typical financial return metrics that could also be considered in decision making. The luminous metrics need intellectual explanation, while the numinous metrics are easy to feel. They're more on the spirit side. They tend to involve non-financial capital metrics, while the luminous ones, when seen in isolation, can be exclusively associated with financial capital. And Somik then connected that to decision analysis practice through a change in every single part of the decision quality wheel. We can easily understand an impact on the value side, where we have not only clear metrics that are a reflection of the cool head, but also bringing in purpose and a noble purpose, which is a function of a warm heart that motivates our strong actions. But you can see impact on every single element of decision quality. This concludes the summary from the presentation on June 20th. I would like now to turn to Elaine, who will walk us through a reflection and a perspective on the evolution of emotions and decision analysis. Elaine?
Thank you, yes. Will you move on to the next slide, please? So basically, I'll be providing a perspective on the evolution, i.e. a modification and a change on the perspective of emotions within decision making and decision analysis. This is a note to say that all the opinions expressed in these few slides that I'll be presenting is my own, and it does not attribute to my employer, which is Pfizer, and all the examples are for illustrative purposes and does not represent the Pfizer portfolio. Next slide, please. So the initial perspective of entering into the decision analysis and decision-making world, there are basically, I think, two perspectives. There is, on the one hand, on the right-hand side, what defines good decision-making. So there will be a defined process, an impartial or objective perspective on the problem, and it's driven by data and fact-based, and there's an analytical approach with a quantitative model to support. And then on the other hand, on the left-hand side is the definition of maybe a bad decision or decision-making process. When there's undefined process, it is extremely subjective or / biased involved. There's little or no data. It's based on intuition and gut and qualitative without quantitative framework. So this is normally seen as like the typical approach to what a good and bad decision or decision-making process entails. So moving on to the next slide, please. Thank you. In terms of the application of DA, so this may not be an issue with decision analysis per se, but how we apply in the corporate setting, in which I'll give us a few examples, a couple of examples in later slides. It may potentially exacerbate the issue of negating or neglecting emotions as part of the decision-making process, because we have adapted from economics and finance, where we are assuming decision makers, senior management, project team members as simply risk neutral, so without risk preferences, utility maximizers, and the sole objective is to maximize monetary value, and that we have leveraged the portfolio management and valuation approach of discounted cash flow. Essentially, it's a very quantitative approach to solving a problem. And however, what we have found over the recent years, there are additional focus in which companies are looking into corporate responsibility and sustainability, focusing on multiple stakeholders. So there are already other factors that companies consider in addition to maximizing simply the finance perspective of maximizing monetary value. However, if we move on to the next slide, please. When Somik, Iyas, and I were co-chairing the Decision Analysis Affinity Group Conference earlier this year, we had a call for papers on a session simply titled Emotions and DA. And the papers, the proposals that we received back were all for personal decision making. So then a question is raised in our heads that, are we living in a dichotomous world within DA where emotions are primarily affiliated with only personal decisions? And is there a place, or perhaps the default is, there is very limited space for emotions to be involved in business setting. So in terms of the personal type decision, I'll just go through some examples so we can orient ourselves as to what we are referring to. The examples could be a personal medical decision of surgery, no surgery, college or career decision of, should I take a job or not, what major to study in. And these are normally characterized by multiple and conflicting objectives and their significant impact on self or on others. And typically, the objective of this is just an example, is to maximize, for example, the duration or the magnitude of one's life's goal. On the other hand, for the business type decisions, the traditional application of decision analysis is around pharmaceutical drug research and development, oil and gas exploration, mining exploration, where the characteristics of these projects have a large upfront investment, a long investment time frame, and significant uncertainties. And the objective is primarily to maximize monetary or shareholders' value. So as you can see here, comparing side by side with the examples, the characteristics, and the objective, it seems like that in the business application of decision analysis, emotions, personal preferences are not involved, and we are maximizing a quantitative number. And yet on the personal side, there are obviously considerations, and these tend to be decisions that that would involve some type of emotions. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So there are two questions to think through. I think that would be helpful to look at. One is, what is a decision model that is helpful to the decision maker? So I'm introducing a concept that Professor Larry Phillips termed requisite decision model. So whenever we use a model, it used to be the case that when I guess I first started in the career of decision analysis, there's a more overt acknowledgement that a model is a tool and it represents the reality. I guess these days with the abundance of data, model seems to take a bigger weighting. However, what a helpful decision model is that the form and the content is sufficient to solve a particular problem. And a model, a decision model, can be considered requisite only if no intuitions emerge about a problem. So the question maybe to think through is that if in the corporate setting we have evaluated a decision problem, identify, quantify uncertainties, quantify endpoints, and yet the team, the senior management are either not choosing the preferred path or continue to iterate and have not aligned on a path of action, then what is the issue with the decision maker simply not maximizing the quantitative objective of monetary value? Or perhaps the other question is, are there factors that the model is not capturing? So the second question that is helpful to ponder on is that emotions, are they specific to the decision type, i.e., do these apply only to personal decision making and not business setting? Or are emotions inherent within the decision problem itself? So maybe to phrase it another way is, are we simply solving a problem quantitatively, or are we actually, we as in decision analyst, decision professional, helping the person figure out what is the best path forward within a very complex problem? So then how would these two questions connect, and how would we then think through incorporating emotions and decision analysis together when we do implement it? If we move on to the next slide, please. I'll give you one example of where at least I have attempted to connect the emotions piece as well as the decision making and the decision process piece. Is that senior management and project team members are human beings with emotions, and in a few slides time I'll highlight maybe some of the common emotions that we may come across when helping senior management or project team members come to a decision. And we have learned, as Yas just summarized Soumik's presentation from the Decision Analysis Affinity Group Conference and the June webinar, that basically if we are overly focused on emotions, the individual or a set of individuals will be disoriented and they will be unable to decide, while minimizing the data, the logic and algorithm component. On the other hand, I think what Soumik's presentation really focuses on is that if we suppress the emotion component and simply focus on data, logic, and algorithm, then the individual or the set of individuals are unable and cannot form preferences, are unable to decide. And we may come across this, although we may not frame it in this way. Maybe one of the terms that we can think of is analysis paralysis. When we present more data, we don't come back with clear decision. We basically sometimes receive more requests to get more data. And so I do wonder if the suppressing the emotions or not incorporating the emotions, we're moving towards more and more into the world where all we are doing in helping the decision-making process is to gather more data. But at the end of the day, what the decision requires is actually commitment to action of a particular decision alternative. So next slide, please. So I'll go through a couple of examples in the corporate setting, how decisions and where are we listening for feelings, as Soumik had mentioned in his previous talk. So there are two examples that I'll go through: decision to invest in high risk, high return investment opportunity, and then the next slide will be on the decision to progress a backup compound. So this is a typical decision tree. It is not a real example, it's illustrative. However, it is not atypical of what a high risk, high return decision tree looks like. So it's a decision tree we read from left to right. We have the decision whether to invest or not. If we do not invest, we do not put any money in. So the endpoint in path 1 is 0. If we invest, then we encounter, at least in the pharmaceutical drug research and development space, different types of uncertainties. In this illustrative example, we start the uncertainty at phase 3 clinical study, meaning that the company is going to invest, is planning to invest money to see if the drug is safe and efficacious in a large population. And as you can see, I've highlighted here that it is a high risk example because the probability of success is very low at 20%, and the cost of failure is probably considered high at about -450. If the company is successful in investing in phase 3, then they would need to go through FDA regulatory review, and then upon approval of the drug, then the compound may face some commercial uncertainties, and obviously the company would be attracted to and is targeting and hoping for a robust return. So I've highlighted path number 6 of $4.5 billion return. So this is typically, like I mentioned, a high risk, high return example where the chance of success is low and the value, if we are successful, is high. So where would the emotions take place and how are we listening to it? So the item is that people may be, so First of all, I like to point out that if we're only looking at the quantitative maximizing the expected net present value perspective, the decision is actually to invest, because 21 is greater than 0, so we invest in 21. We decide to invest. However, the senior management project team members may be a little hesitant if they're overly concerned or overly focusing on the 20% probability of success, and or the minus $450 million if the investment fail. And this is particularly maybe more prevalent or of focus if the company continues a high risk, high return strategy, and that they continue or have in the past observed a lot of failures. So maybe the past 3 high risk, high return is a failure. Now this is a 4th example. They may, rather than just say, okay, let's go and invest because the EMPV is $21 million, there may be some hesitancy, and the decision makers may not choose what we are seeing as the optimal path forward. So the question that we then ask ourselves as decision analysts supporting the problem is that are they being maybe biased in some way by availability bias because of the recency of failure, or are there factors that we have not thoroughly explored when defining the objective? So that's one example of where we can pick up emotions and see how that affects the choice of decision alternatives. If we move on to the next slide, please. The other example that I like to go through with you is the decision to progress a lead compound and a backup compound. So in the pharmaceutical space, for those unfamiliar, is that sometimes a company would have 2 candidates to take forward to the next phase of development, the lead compound, which is the one that is ahead, and then the backup targeting essentially the same indication, so the same disease, the same type of population, but with very minute differences in the compound structure, but similar mechanism of action. So the way that it works is very similar, however, there are compound-specific differences. So this is an example of where there could be misalignment between team members. So the discussion could be focusing on path number 1, where the decision is to actually progress lead and backup. And there could be some team members that are thinking through, well, it doesn't make sense because normally a pharmaceutical company do not commercialize the same mechanism of action, targeting the same population with 2 compounds. Usually only one gets onto the market. So the thinking could be that there is limited value in pursuing and progressing both the lead compound and the backup compound. However, maybe there is a group of people in either senior management or project team members that are extremely concerned about a negative outcome. So path number 6, where if we choose not to invest in the backup compound and the lead fails, then that is actually a concerning scenario, because now we have invested in a drug and we are not going to see and realize the revenue, therefore unable to benefit the patients. So the emotion, the word that was that perhaps would be used to describe is just a lot of angst around this decision, because it is driven by path, or overweighted by path number 6, where if there is no backup and it fails, then there would be no opportunity to address a particular disease area. So then it would help us to facilitate discussion on looking at what is the preference and what is the willingness to pay for the backup compound to be progressed, so that we can actually explore path number 3, where if the lead compounds fail and we have a backup that could be successful, what would that look like? So essentially having a risk mitigation strategy. So one helpful way of maybe just incorporating the emotions into DA is to listen for the different emotions of what different parties hold to get to an alignment. So the next slide is to show, based on a recent paper, the complexity of emotions. So there are good reasons why we may not want to incorporate emotions into decision making, especially in the corporate setting, because people are faced with different emotions. However, I think I've highlighted, so there's a recent paper that highlighted that individuals actually have 27 emotions, and that the emotions, a gradation of each other, but I've actually highlighted and in bold that these may be typical emotions that we may want to listen for as we are working with team members, as we're working for senior management. We may not actually, so these are from the psychology literature, so in the corporate setting, we may not use exact words as anxiety, sadness. We may use words like disappointment, concern, angst, or one question that we like to ask ourselves is, what issues are keeping you up at night? So that would also reveal where we are maybe placing disproportionate weight or thinking of the emotion at a certain particular path, decision path. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So this is one suggestion of how we can incorporate emotions in the existing DA process and where it may help. So first of all, we are not saying that, I think I just want to highlight that we're not saying that we would go back to not having a decision-making process and think that data is bad. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that decision analysis continues to be helpful. However, emotions can be used as an input towards requisite decision-making. So what are we listening for, and what components and what part of the decision-making process are we listening for these emotions? So there's the framing, structuring, decision. We can listen to see if there's over enthusiasm, excitement, or concern when we define the objectives. The second part is collect data inputs, where if our perspective preferences would lead us to interpret the data or biases in us in some way. And then when we're developing the evaluation model, so the quantitative model, are there risk preferences, so risk aversion or risk-seeking preferences that we have not accounted for if we are simply maximizing the objective function of one quantitative number? And finally, when we move on to the next stage of analysis and interpretation, I think this is the easiest to identify, is that if there are a lot of concern on one uncertain parameter, we can actually run sensitivity analysis. And then finally, the recommend decision is that what we want ultimately is clarity of thought that leads to clarity of action. So DA may help to highlight where there are confusion and lack of clarity because emotions are involved, and ultimately that leads to what Iyas and Soumik have termed achieve equanimity. So if we move on to the final slide before we open it up for interactive dialogue, is that I'll just leave you with Professor Ron Howard, who is the seminal figure in decision analysis, about where we may incorporate emotions as part of good decision and decision quality. So a good decision, he defines it as an action we take that is logically consistent with the alternatives we perceive, the information we have, and the preferences we feel. And as we have highlighted, emotions may help us form the preferences and therefore come to an alignment on the decision path and in choosing the decision alternative. So with that, thank you. And I will turn this back to Iyas, where we would start the interactive dialogue.
Thank you, Elaine. So what I would like to do is to start with questions that were submitted ahead of time, which was an option for those who registered for this webinar. We have a set of questions. Actually, there's the first question was submitted after the June webinar. So that would be the first question to start with. And that was, what rebiasing techniques should we think of to compensate for debiasing going too far? And this goes to the issue of emotions potentially biasing our assessments, and we might have gone too far in that with regard to decision analysis, and how can we swing this pendulum a little farther back towards the center. Perhaps, Soumik, you can reflect on that, and Elaine and I can chime in afterwards.
Sure. One test that has worked really well for me is to see how people talk about their preferences, and if they are very flat about it, that means that they've gone too far, and they may have gone too far. And I'll give you one example. I was once talking to a leader of an organization who framed this question for me that, hey, Soumik, we are interested in creating a corporate giving program, and we want to make an impact in world hunger and poverty and a whole bunch of things. And how do you make decisions? How do you allocate resources into these big high impact areas? And so the way he spoke about this, I felt absolutely no sense of reverence, no sense of internal commitment to these causes. So he might as well just have added at the end, and I want to eat a burger today. So I told him, look, I don't believe you care about any of these causes. So he was a little bit surprised when I said that. And I said, look, let's talk about where your juice lies. And it turns out that this person was very motivated about people making good decisions. And so then I proposed that, hey, maybe the issue isn't about solving world hunger or poverty. The issue is that the people working in these causes are often not making the best decisions they can. And so your mission really is to improve the quality of decisions being made, and perhaps you would work with the people in this field to help improve decision quality instead of giving them money in these causes. And that would feel much more authentic for you. And that's the kind of inquiry which, not only resonated, but it's a question for each one of us, that there are these causes that in theory sound wonderful and noble, but they're simply not authentic for us. And the way we know they're not authentic is that they all sound exactly the same. Like we can't tell which one's for us. And that's a very powerful test to check if we really debiased ourselves out of our own feelings, out of our own preferences.
And I would add to this is that when you get to an assessment of a metric that is important for the decision, and you're thinking of rebiasing, you're already too far actually into the analysis. And the inclusion of emotions, as Soumik was mentioning, is basically a way to ask and probe much deeper than we typically do, so that you frame the decision with a depth that touches the purpose and alternatives that really move the spirit, in addition to being more kind of factual and base. And thus, you still need to deal with debiasing the assessments, but ahead of time, to have a full view of the decision structure. That's, I think, deep listening is really the core difference, I would say, with including emotions in a next level. Okay, Elaine, anything else to add?
Yeah, and I think I'll just add maybe a slightly different perspective. Instead of thinking rebiasing and debiasing, it's really around the have we not captured something that is important to the decision maker, where they are now skewing on one side of their perspective in viewing the decision problem.
Thank you. Moving on to the second question. Can the panelists offer practical instances of use of this approach in their decision analysis projects? Soumik, can you shed some light first?
Sure. I've seen this in various situations. So first of all, the word DA projects is kind of interesting. So depending on how we interpret this, personal life decisions can be actually quite big decision projects. And two people who come to mind are Krista Romkins from our community, who used decision analysis to figure out treatment options for her son, and Jeremy Walker, who also used decision analysis to help his son make college decisions. And from my own experience, what I've been most moved by is this was when I was at SmartOrg. David Matheson and I were working with a plastic packaging company, and they got stuck basically because they couldn't tell the difference between any of the alternatives. And so we did a values inquiry on who they wanted to be, and that completely unlocked their energy. And it was remarkable. It's like there was a before and there was an after. So they realized that they had a very powerful mission to bring safety, to make food more natural, to make food more affordable, and to basically make the planet more sustainable by growing less food, because you could preserve food. And so their packaging really was in service of these core values. And suddenly they realized that this, this was upstream of their decision analysis. So if somebody said, hey, acquire this company, then they would ask these questions of fit. And only if it passed, then they would look at the numbers to see, is this the best opportunity we have in service of our values? So that was a very, very powerful shift. And immediately people connected to the alternatives, and they could generate more alternatives as well. That's one story.
Thank you. Elaine?
I believe I have given two examples just now on the application, or where we can listen for emotions preferences in illustrative examples DA projects.
Thank you. Yeah, and I would add also maybe a bit of a caveat about this, is that what I have learned in the journey of connecting emotions with decisions in a deeper way, I definitely think differently now about how I listen to decision makers. At the same time, the full impact on how this will affect how I would handle decision analysis projects is yet to be fully manifested in my practice, and I'm guessing the practice of many of us. So I'm guessing this is a concept that would continue to evolve, and we will probably continue to sharpen these skill sets. But certainly listening deeper and connecting the value metrics and the frame and alternative to the purpose of decision makers and organizations is the aspect that I think would be changing significantly with this approach.
Yes, may I add one more thing to this?
Absolutely.
If you go to the next slide, I think that this is probably one of the most underappreciated concepts in decision analysis, and this idea of preference probability. So this is the idea that when you're looking at prospects, which is the end, this is, by the way, the classic party problem in decision analysis that's used by Professor Ron Howard to teach foundational concepts. So the frame of this is, Professor Howard's daughter wants to have a party, but she doesn't know if it will be sunny or rainy. And there's certain prospects she likes a lot, like outdoor sunny party is the best. And if it rains and you're outdoors, that's the worst. And everything else is in between. And what he showed was you can convert how you feel about something into how much you want it. And so that's the concept of preference probabilities, which are called U values. And by the way, this has nothing to do with utility, the economist's understanding of utility, which is why we don't use the term utility. And this has everything to do with our feelings. And I want to call this out because this is one of the least used constructs in decision analysis. By assuming risk neutrality, we completely skip the conversation of how much do we want something. And risk aversion, by the way, allows us to do something similar, but define it on top of money. So just want to throw that in the mix, that maybe we ought to look at this as a bridge of bringing our feelings into the table.
Thank you, Soumik. Moving on to the third question, provide examples illustrating how you did things differently in applying decision quality 2.0 concepts. Maybe Soumik, I think you developed that additional reflection of that wheel. Maybe you can start.
Yeah, if you don't mind going to the next slide. So we have the decision quality wheel. By the way, this was some work David Matheson and I did together. And there's a free course on this that, there's a link there. People are welcome to look at it. And the basic idea is that we want to bring meaning into purpose. So we are pretty good on what's the purpose of our meeting, what's the purpose of the project. And we don't bring into the space the question of whether is this purpose really meaningful to us. So in the frame, it'd be useful as a head question, but is the inquiry meaningful to us is a very powerful additional dimension. And the broad context is that our decision quality framework works really well. And what the emotion angle does is it deepens the line of questioning. Similarly, alternatives, yes, we want to know that the ideas are really different. That means we're pushing ourselves to think, but are they also interesting to us? So if people are not really interested in the alternatives, it means we haven't tapped into their feelings, into who they want to be. And maybe that's another yardstick for alternatives. Are they really interesting to us? And information, there's this, the head question is, are they credible? And the heart is, are they compelling? And I remember an oil and gas executive once told me that they developed an alternative that improved safety a lot more than before. And so he went to his boss saying, hey, should we do a multi-attribute decision analysis trading off safety and profit? And his boss said, why? If this is really making a quantum leap on safety, and safety is our core value, and we're still making money, this is a no-brainer. I don't need you to do a multi-attribute decision analysis on this. Go for it if you really believe that this is going to be safe, much safer. So that's like a compelling piece of information which made the decision pretty clear because they knew who they wanted to be. And I'll skip the value piece because ES has already talked about it. And the integration piece is, so this is the one thing that we renamed, that logic is just the head piece. So that's the insightful reasoning. But so just as important is the inspiring narrative, because we're never working as an island, we're working with a community. And so what's the narrative that really takes the community along? By itself, it could be manipulative, but when combined with insightful reasoning, it makes the insightful reasoning really land. And finally, the commitment is, yes, we want to have very well-planned decisions, action plans, and all of that is super important. But just as important is the aligning of intention. And if we do not align intentions, then our decisions will easily get sabotaged. And anybody working in any organization knows it doesn't matter if you're a small or a large one. If intentions are not aligned, you can't get anywhere, basically. So those are some ways in which our beloved framework can be deepened. And it's just as relevant, in fact, even more relevant with this deepening.
Thank you, Soumik. I'll move on to the next question. I like the brushing teeth twice a day metric example. Can you provide similar examples of good metrics to get groups to appropriate action in implementing DA decisions? Soumik?
Very quickly, if you could go to slide number 8. I would say that the examples that actually you covered, yes, on the difference between luminous and numinous metrics is a pretty good place to start. So for instance, we talked about fundraisers and how if you just optimize for how much money you raise, that's practical, that's necessary, but that's not very inspiring. But when you focus on something like percentage participation, you're communicating something very different, that everybody's voice matters equally. And this happened. This is actually a real metric in my daughter's school. And I felt so inspired to participate when I realized that's what they were optimizing on. And that, because my first knee-jerk reaction is, oh, I don't have that much to give. And when they said, no, it doesn't matter if you give $10 or $1,000, but what matters is you participate because you're a member of the community, my heart opened up. And then I started reading their fundraiser letters. And then I realized that, well, they have a story around what they're raising and why they need to get to that goal. And it has to do with community. They're serving the community. And similarly, in the VC case, the 10x probability weighted multiple is the way in which we organize our decision making. But really, the thing that we're actually optimized on is highlighted by the numinous metric, which is the number of referrals we get from entrepreneurs we said no to. And just think about how we have to show up and what kind of a process we need to do for entrepreneurs to feel so respected that they will recommend us even when we say no to them. And the 10x, by the way, then you can start to see that the 10x is how we deliver on it. It's not that it gives us that optimal value. It's that it allows us to respect entrepreneurs in that deep sort of way. So these are some examples, and I would argue that all of decision analysis is an optimization for equanimity, that you are delivering peace. Yes, you're delivering value, but what you're also delivering is a peace of mind that I did the best I could, and I'm now free to make the next best decision in my life. And that's kind of, when you look at it that way, that's the numinous angle of it. For any metric, they have both numinous and numinous angles.
Thank you, Soumik. I'm going to move in the next question, and this one is about decision making in the corporate world, and perhaps Elaine, you can reflect on that. How do we incorporate these concepts about emotions and decision making in corporations where clear corporate values are likely already established and or fiduciary responsibilities exist?
Yeah, I think this is an excellent question. I don't think I have a good answer, because we do, although there are, and it's also something that I've been pondering on, although there are individual preferences that the decision makers may hold, there are also corporate, there needs to be continuation and continuity of corporate objectives and corporate goals. So I think this is, we would like to incorporate emotions because I think it needs to be context appropriate. Like I mentioned in the example, if a company have experienced a lot of high risk, high return failure, they may suddenly, turn towards more risk aversion, and that may not necessarily mean that they're making a bad decision if they're not just maximizing financial value. However, there could be maybe additional corporate values, corporate objectives that needs to be clearly articulated or think through, that could be multidimensional, that is not being captured right now. So I would also explore the objective setting component of the decision-making process.
Thank you, Elaine. This question is also related to the next question around corporate setting, where value mapping and preferences have an obvious role in personal decision-making, but possibly in new organizations. How do we think of the same regarding big organizations, especially in the corporate setting? Let me start on this one. From my vantage point, good corporations would have clarity of the values and the purpose that they're established upon, but not all corporations have the same clarity on these aspects. Sometimes big decisions force the corporations to get back to that purpose and values that the corporation is founded upon. And sometimes it takes disasters for a corporation to do so. I think of Uber as a recent example, with somewhat of a misaligned values that put the company in trouble, forcing the company now to really ask themselves, what do they want to be as a corporation? I don't think this is an exercise that needs to be done for every decision analysis project, but I do feel that a corporation needs very clear mapping of the whole corporation to its own corporate values and purpose, and why it exists and what is it trying to serve. And that has to be beyond the mere shareholder financial value. It has to serve societal impact as well as part of it. Any other comments, Soumik or Elaine, you'd like to offer on this?
Well, I personally feel that it's a huge myth that values are well established in organizations. What I've actually found is that everyone assumes what the values of the organization are, and people often don't agree with these assumptions. And so I think that's where the value of decision analysis really comes up, that through the analysis, we get an excellent way of inquiring into these values, that what if we were to value this, then this would be the implication. And if we had this other value, that would be the implication. And the implication I've found is a very powerful way of connecting us to what feels right. And then you work your way backwards into your values and say, now I get it. And now I can actually explain it intellectually as well and feel that this is the right choice. And so that's like real gold. Like when you can find your values and be able to explain why you're doing what you're doing, but it takes the hard work of the analysis to get there. So, and that's been at least the finding from my work at the Moore Foundation, where we used the analysis to figure out what the values of the team were. It's a very different way of thinking about DA.
Thank you. Elaine, any questions that came from the audience that we need to answer? And perhaps we have time for one question.
Yes, there is a question which I think is very fascinating. What is the influence of incentives on emotions in corporate settings? how would you dissect emotions stemming from misaligned objectives / incentives? So perhaps, ES, would you like to take a stab at? Yep.
This is a very interesting question. I think misalignment of incentives is quite pervasive. And I believe it goes back to the answer of the previous question regarding the clarity of the underpinning purpose and value of the organization. So incentives or metrics that individuals need to take into consideration for their own personal decisions, behaviors, basically, as they eventually aggregate towards a corporate or organizational direction and action, they need to be driven by the purpose and value of that organization. And the more aligned they are there, the more the organization will start actually moving towards that direction. This happens actually usually in the implementation side rather than the strategic decision-making side, when you make the decision and then you go to implementation, and many decisions fail in implementation, perhaps due to either lack of clarity and communication of why we're making that specific strategic choice. And again, that needs to be connected to the values and purpose. And the other one is that how you implement the decision gives people cues that your true values may not be what was articulated at the beginning. So it's a great question, and it's something for us to ponder on the implementation side. Good. I think this takes us to the top of the hour. I would like to thank the audience today, as well as all of those who submitted questions. This is definitely an interesting and intriguing topic, and I suspect that this will not be the last time that we talk about it. And with this, I would like to turn to Brig to conclude this webinar.
Great, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's Learning Exchange. I'd like to thank everyone for their time and contributions to today's discussion. I'd like to remind you that you may find the replay of this webinar on our website at decisionprofessionals.com. Thank you for being with us today, and you may now disconnect.